вновь продолжает собой. И сердцу тревожно в груди, и Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along to a broadcast from a new angle due to a change of desk. So, appropriately enough, you can see behind my shoulder there the busts of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, which is very appropriate for any broadcast. So, welcome along. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. We are live on YouTube, on X, and on Substack, and on Twitch, which is an increasingly popular platform for us, it would seem. So hello to everybody who's tuned in so far. So this is in some ways a redoing, but also in some respects an evolution of the stream we tried the other day, where essentially due to horrendous technical failures, things didn't work very well. So it gave me the opportunity to do this again, and I think do probably a more thorough job on these various national security concepts, competing national security concepts from the United States, the infamous document published by the Trump administration recently, recent state building and state security projects that have been undertaken by the Russian Federation, and also the national security strategy of the People's Republic of China since 2020, really. But the Xi era in China is most interesting when considering this concept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through each of the major documents related to the national security in each of the three major powers of the world. Now, in the American case, it is drawn from the Trump administration, which had published its strategy recently. However, I'm also going to make comparisons to the national security strategy of the Biden administration and the Obama administration, the two most recent Democratic Party administrations in the United States, to argue the case that, of course, there will be a great deal of continuity despite all of the claims of vast difference in the Trump administration's recently published paper. Then from the Russian side of things, we have two documents, one from 2021 and one from just last month in November 2025, which deal with similar things in terms of state policy. Now, that, of course, is, again, like the Russian government being a slightly different system, reflects that in the bodies that work on these things. But the Russian state security documents, again, deal with the concept of security in a much more holistic way than the American version does. But we'll come to that when we get to the Russian paper. However, it is important to say that the Russian Security Council, which produces these papers, is, I would say, the highest decision-making body in the Russian system, and is the direct successor to the old Politburo of the CPSU and the USSR. In fact, it plays a similar role. It's at a higher level than the Russian cabinet of ministers, for instance. And when we come to the Chinese haven't previously published a great deal of material in English regarding the concept of national security. That's changed a little bit in the Xi era, but the document I'm working off from China is a recent national security document taken from their Ministry of Defense website. And as my Chinese is very, very, very limited to saying ni hao, and that's about it, I've had to use a machine translation to look at this. And I used, in the end, Yandex, which was nominally, looks to be the best one. So the Chinese national security paper from the Ministry of Defense is that which we'll be considering today. Now, when you look at all of these documents together and read them one after the other, as I've done, you find quite quickly, you can guess which is the imperialist power and which isn't, because the US document is riddled all the way through, and how could it be any other way, with actions that it wants the US government to take, which can only be described as, of course, the reinforcing of US imperialist hegemony, or the attempt to reinforce it, or shore it up, I think is the better way of putting it. The Chinese and the Russian documents deal almost entirely with security for the nation, as in within the borders of the nation. There is a bit in the Russian document about the promotion of Russian language and culture in other places around the world. But the contrast between China, Russia, and US concepts of national security are, of course, very much bound up with which country is the imperialist power. So, moving then to look at the first of these, which is the Trump administration's US national security strategy, published last month. And we'll get into the meat of this now. As I said earlier, I will repeat, so be sure to like and share the stream. Be sure to subscribe to the relevant platforms that we're broadcasting on today. For some reason, Rumble is not letting us stream to that at the moment, so I'll have to go back and take a look at why that is. So we'll now get into the US national security strategy, and thanks to all those of you who joined us on X, by the way. So US national security strategy, this document deals with it purports to deal with what the Trump administration claims is the decline of the US caused by the Democrats, Biden, insert name of oligarchic political rival here. But what it represents is two things. First of all, there is a great deal of continuity, both for all its denunciations of the Biden administration. There's a great deal of continuity in this paper with the priorities of the Biden administration. It's just the language is different, and we'll come to the language choices in just a moment. Now, where it is slightly different is that it is mostly rhetorical in terms of the changes between the Biden and the Trump administration in terms of what is emphasized and the way in which the US portrays itself outside of the United States when it's projecting power. See, in the Biden administration, I mean, it is literally the old meme with the two B-52s, one on top of the other. When you have the Biden administration, the Democrats, the B-52's got like a rainbow flag or a trans flag on it, and it's dropping bombs labeled net zero, LGBTQ plus, and literacy, empowering women, those kind of slogans. With the Trump administration, and bear in mind, when the United States, as a matter of tactics in various different parts of the world, chooses to emphasize things like LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, rights of national minorities, commitment to any of that, of course, what it is the using that to build networks, intelligence networks, influencing networks. That's what the NGO world is there to do, and that's incredibly obvious that that is the case when one looks at the actual activities of the NGOs and why so many countries are now looking to restrict them. In fact, there's whole long discussions, both in the 2021 paper from the Russian Security Council and in various different white papers and laws passed into action by the Chinese government about the activities of NGOs, and the fact that both the Russians and the Chinese consider these to be hostile foreign entities that either need to be banned entirely or kept under very strict government surveillance. And so it's obvious what these things are. So that the difference is that whereas the Biden administration chose the woke agenda to push to try and build networks through that, the Trump administration is trying something different, and they're trying basically to go back to the old meme of the B-52s. The B-52 now has the American flag on it, and he's just dropping bombs. If anything, the Republicans are a little more honest. So the Trump administration, in its sort of official ideology, if one can call it that, it differs from the Biden administration, but this is a difference in tactics. This is a difference in the rhetoric that is used and the way in which they try and win people over. Now, the Trump administration is talking about how the nation state is the center of all things. Of course, that never stopped being the case. If the nation state wasn't the center of all political and economic activity, then the US imperialists wouldn't have spent so long trying to undermine the sovereignty of every other nation state in the world that it wants to target. Just look at their actions over Venezuela right now. Whereas the Biden administration would talk about their love for democracy, rule of law, rules-based international order, etc. The Trump administration and their rhetoric talks in much more transactional terms. So whereas the Democrats like to talk about these sort of grand sweeping faux liberatory projects, Trump administration is talking like, well, we're going to do, we're not going to apologize for America, which is a thing that the Republicans have accused the Democrats of for a long time, which is a joke. The Democrats have never apologized for any of the crimes they've committed. They've just apologized for, sort of grudgingly, for things that happened 200 years ago. The Trump administration is much more, typically flag waving. We don't apologize for anything. We are America. Fuck you, kind of thing. Which is always the reality of American power. It's just that the Biden administration, the Obama administration, tried to hide that behind a series of rhetorical flourishes, shall we say. So the Trump paper accuses the previous administrations, presumably including the first Trump administration, of lacking focus, of making America weak, of overseeing deindustrialization, which was true, of course. And we'll get to the industrial strategy bit in just a moment. And that the US's sovereignty as a nation is threatened, which is an interesting admission, because wrapped up in the usual reactionary whining about America has fallen victim to being ripped off. This is one of Trump's things. It's also one of Pat Buchanan's things from 30 years ago. Pat Buchanan, he was sort of the original. He was Trump before there was Trump. He was much more fully worked out concept of MAGA before MAGA, so to speak, and came very close, or came quite close to winning the Republican nomination against George H.W. Bush in for the 1992 presidential election. Picked up quite a lot of votes. Ultimately, a lot of those went over to, it would seem, Ross Perot. But Buchanan used to talk about America getting ripped off a lot. Now, of course, again, Trump picked this up, and it's a standard complaint of American reactionaries for a long time. Now, if you dig down into this paper, what does it mean? First of all, you have to penetrate beyond the whinging and the complaining. And you find out that what it's referring to basically is Trump's complaint that America's getting done over on trade, and China's eating our lunch, everybody. Now, there is a certain element of truth to that, which is that, of course, the Chinese have not only overtaken the United States in key areas of technology, but are also now becoming like the premier trading partner for most of the nations in the world, because America produces less and less. And as is always the manner with late stage imperialist countries, they produce less and just move around giant amounts of capital, investing in various places and divesting from others. So what the Buchanan and Trump rhetoric always referred to was a certain complaint from the lower section of the American capitalist class. So the section of the American capitalist class whose business does not involve a giant amount of international trade, or only that is a marginal concern, that is mainly focused domestically, that sometimes is focused purely on like a statewide level. The complaint of the American upper petty bourgeoisie, smaller capitalists, has always been basically that someone's ripping them off, like the big guys on Wall Street are ripping them off, which is true, that they're getting ripped off and America's getting done over and we're getting out-competed. And so the Buchanan-Trump rhetoric has always appealed to that layer of the typical small capitalist, very lowest end of the capitalist class, or this sort of traditional American petty bourgeoisie, small capitalist, small business owner. That's the base for this stuff. That and a certain layer of the American working class. Though it must be emphasized that the biggest non-voting group in the United States is the poorer working class, which, in my view, is always the point that a communist should start at in terms of trying to reach those people. But that's another story. So the Trump rhetoric says basically that the terrible Biden administration and the terrible Obama administration had led to America getting ripped off all over the world, and also that the sovereignty of the United States was under threat due to mass migration, etc., borders falling apart. We're being invaded, folks. We're being invaded right now. They're coming. They're selling tacos on your front lawn. And there was mass migration is then associated in the paper with security threats such as drugs, human trafficking, and terrorism, which is, of course, drugs, human trafficking, and terrorism are the business of and the common practice of the CIA and every other American intelligence agency. So you have to laugh when you hear like American president whinging about that. It's like, well, this is basically how your intelligence agencies do business now and always have done, as Mike Pompeo once confessed to. Now, they are also talking about, increasing what they call the resilience of critical infrastructure in the United States. And this is, again, a complaint that Trump has raised. And in this, he is completely correct. The infrastructure of the United States, as acknowledged by not just, you don't have to be a Marxist to work this out. Anybody with eyes can work it out. We mentioned before the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore and its destruction by that drifting large transport ship, container ship a while ago, and the fact that it's going to cost billions and not be rebuilt for at least another 5 years tells you that American infrastructure is terrible. And this isn't just like bridges, this is railway lines. There was the disastrous chemical spill about 18 months ago, I believe, which spilt a giant amount of chemicals and poisoned the whole area. And that was down to the fact that the American railway system is a crumbling disaster. If you just go online, you can find footage of like the fact that the tracks in many American railroads are warped and wobbly, and the trains can barely stay on them. And the trains that derail are these vast goods trains, often transporting like flammable chemicals and things like that. So in the sense that the Trump administration is talking about critical civilian and military infrastructure being severely compromised, they're right about that. There's no doubt about that. The question is, well, whether they will be able to do anything about it. Now, the Biden administration also identified this as a problem because everybody can see it. Now, their solution was like things like Build Back Better, which didn't really, in the end, sort of petered out. The Inflation Reduction Act, both of these were giant subsidy bills of the Biden administration, which were designed to stimulate infrastructure development in the American states. This didn't work because what happens is the money assigned by the federal government, just as is always the case in these late stage imperialist countries, gets filtered off by dozens of different middlemen and parasites, both private, public, and other, and sort of non-governmental, that essentially insert themselves as inserted as middlemen into every like federal contract. Same is true in Britain, by the way, and money drains away, and what projects do get built or do get restored get done with a vastly overinflated budget, not delivering anything like what they originally promised. And that's a problem in all areas in the United States. Like every project gets like, and not just the United States, true in Britain, it's true in France. Every project ends up with a massively bloated cost to it. Same is true in Britain with regard to the nuclear power plants the government's trying to build. The cost just balloons, and that's partly due to the incredibly inefficient way that the government does these infrastructure projects, because it all has to be contracted out. Every job has to be contracted out, and then again, like there are loads of middlemen in every contracting out process. Everybody inflates their fees. There's all kinds of management consultant fees attached to everything. The project is usually staffed by a lot of individual contractors rather than directly employed workers. And individual contractors, of course, can charge a hell of a lot more, especially if they're in the management or the technical level. And you end up, after all of that, with a project where the cost just bloats. That's what late stage imperialism looks like, where you have on the top level parasitism from the banking sector, which is, of course, always intimately involved with these things. You have the government basically as a source of endless money for private contractors, and every project reflects that inefficiency and that corruption and that draining of money away. That's what late stage imperialism looks like. That and the fact that costs, of course, in the imperial core nations are higher because you need to pay the workers more. And so you have like a system which is just a sponge, soaks up an infinite amount of money and pours, and then even if you squeeze it, somehow the liquid cash doesn't come out again. So whether the Trump administration will be able to overcome all of these problems associated with infrastructure development is yet to be worked out. However, I really don't think that Donald Trump is capable of, and his merry men are capable of tackling these problems any more than Joe Biden was, any more than the Obama administration was. Because if you recall back to the Obama administration, they were also talking about, oh, we need to improve our infrastructure, we need to improve our security against natural disasters, etc., etc. None of it led to anything. Like every major project in the United States that gets taken on ends up, as I said, costing a ton more and delivering far less than was originally promised. Compare that to how the Chinese do business, and you can really see the inefficiency and corruption on display here. So moving on to look at a couple of other things. They're talking about developing a robust industrial base. The US must be put back into its position as the strongest and most innovative economy. There will be the rebuilding of the industrial base that can sustain both peacetime and wartime production. So they're basically promising to go back to a system that was last seen, or should we say, they want to get back to the output level that was last seen in the 40s. Conceivably, like the United States could have sustained like that kind of production into the 60s, but after 65, really, arguably even earlier, the rapid deindustrialization starts to take place. Becomes more and more obvious into the 80s, and a glaring problem in the 90s. And successive administrations from 2008 onwards have always said, I mean, this was Obama's thing as well. One of his commitments was to rebuild the American industrial base. He was unable to do so, just as Biden was unable to do it, and the first Trump administration was unable to do it, for reasons we've gone into before, and we'll come back to later. But here, the other interesting thing was the paper proclaims that the US must retain global leadership in oil, gas, coal, nuclear, and emerging energy technology usage. And also, the paper quite clearly says that the US retains the right to use energy exports as a tool to leverage both so-called allies and adversaries. So the US must retain global control, essentially, or the leading preeminent position in all of those industries, and must control the trade in them, and must control the trade routes, which is why in the paper they specifically say they want to exercise control over the Red Sea, over key pressure points of the oil trade. And that's crucial, of course, for American imperial strategy. It's linked to the petrodollar. It's linked to dollar supremacy, of course. So then we get some, other less, should we say, interesting but marginal things. So there's a lot of complaints in there about intellectual property protection. We've gone into before why the US and Western whinging about China on that score is largely nonsense. I mean, I'm sure the Chinese do engage in industrial espionage. I'm damn certain that the British, French, Germans, and the Americans do it. But most of the tech that the US and the British and the others are complaining about the Chinese now racing ahead on, this was tech that China developed itself, or the Chinese initially studied the forebears of that technology that was shared with them under contracts signed as early as the late 70s and early 1980s. Like, for instance, in the Deng Xiaoping era, one of the first co-production facilities that opened up in China was one that was a co-production between a Chinese state-owned company and Volkswagen to produce parts for cars in China. Now, this was one of the first big partnerships between West Germany, which, of course, the West German capitalists were delighted to have this cheap Chinese labor available. But again, it was specified very early on that they wanted to have access to technology. They wanted to have the technology shared with the Chinese state-owned enterprises that were partnering with a lot of these companies. And this was something that, of course, Germany, France, British, American capitalists were all happy to do 40 years ago, because in their arrogant minds, there was no way that the primitive Chinese would ever be able to take this, understand it, develop it further, and then put it into practice to a much more effective degree than their former economic superiors in the West could. But that is what has happened. Now, all of them are whinging and complaining about the fact that they've lost this edge. Well, the edge was lost because the Chinese kept developing technologically and the West stopped. The West not just rested on its laurels, but became more and more parasitic, less dependent upon the production of new technologies and new commodities, and more dependent upon the moving around of large amounts of money, or large amounts of capital, I should say. And so there's complaints and there's moaning about AI, but there's also an assertion in there that the US must remain the global leader in AI, quantum computing, biotech, and other high technology fields. Now, because we're all aware of the AI bubble in the United States, what they've ended up doing, and this was something that both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have fueled, is diverting gigantic amounts of public subsidy to the big tech companies, giving them vast contracts with the US federal government, and bloating up a gigantic bubble, which is only going to burst. And there, of course, have been advances in AI technology in the United States and in the West. I use quite a bit of it myself to do artwork and audio production. But one of the things that the Chinese have done with AI technology is to analyze how they can make their industries run more efficiently. And this is the Chinese are finding in their application of machine learning, let's call it that because that's more accurate, that they can actually cut down on the amount of labor required in a lot of extraction industries. And so one of the things that they're doing in their coal mining industry is they're not only using machine learning tools to identify new coal deposits, but also identify ways in which the maximum yield can be got for the minimum amount of labor, which, again, that sounds like a capitalist's dream, but it's something which is actually happening in China, whereas the capitalists just stopped using coal in the West. Or, well, that's not, they stopped extracting coal. The Germans are now buying coal from other people to make up for the fact that they abolished their nuclear industry. Now, the triumph for Greens there. So then we have things like the pro-worker policy, which I dismiss as nonsense, because it's what it's all about. Ultimately, it's just reheated Reaganism. All the talk of like we're going to deliver for the hardworking American. Well, the hardworking American, it turns out, wants tax cuts, and deregulation. Now, this is basically the same economic prescription that the Reagan administration or the George W. Bush administration would have followed, which is, and again, like the obsession of the Republicans with deregulation does reflect to a certain extent, again, the class basis of their party, which is a little bit different to the other party of oligarchy in the United States, the Democrats, which is that the reason why the Republicans are always push for deregulation is because they do more represent the smaller capitalists in the United States than the Democrats do. The Democrats now are much, much more the party of the most gigantic financial parasites. They're on the Republican side as well, but there's more small capitalists in general on the Republican side, which is why they're always obsessed with like deregulation. Deregulation, tax cuts, etc., in the belief that that's going to be something which is going to stimulate or help to re-engage or reignite industrialization. This won't work. It won't, because the taxation and regulation is not the core reason why America deindustrialized. The core reason why any imperialist state deindustrializes is always the same. It amounts to, well, essentially two things. One, the amount of money required, the amount of payment required to labor in the United States, so that for skilled labor in particular, or even unskilled labor in certain manufacturing industries, the amount of money the capitalists had to pay workers in those industries was too much. So you could not profitably employ labor in the United States to do a lot of the manufacturing that used to get done in like Youngstown, Ohio, and places like that, which is why so much of it got outsourced. So the fundamental problem lies in the cost of labor in the United States, which can't be resolved, not without the federal government waging a very aggressive class war, even more than it is already, against the working class, and lowering the amount that it takes for a US worker to sustain themselves and their family. Now, the British ruling class, over almost 200 years ago, for a while did manage to lower the cost of living whilst freezing and at some certain points even reducing wages. And they were able to do so partially by making domestic agriculture more efficient, but mainly by using their dominant position in the world market to bring in more and more cheaper foodstuffs into Britain that workers could buy. So whereas you were freezing wages, they were actually reducing the cost of living for workers. So workers actually had slightly more or about the same income, real income, even when their wages had been frozen, because the prices went down. Trump, just like Biden, has not and can and will not be able to bring the prices down, not without a major change that will damage the interests of the American ruling class. So there's part of the problem. The other part of the problem lies in the very nature of capitalism itself. Capitalism is, again, in its progressive phase in the United States, is capable of these giant leaps forward. It's capable of these giant feats of industrialization, of the vast improvement in the efficiency of production lines. Like I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. By the mid 1850s, like the American industrialists were commissioning production lines that were more and more automated, where things that were done by hand in Britain were now being done by machine in the United States, but as early as the 1850s. And that was, again, products of like the waves of capitalist innovation that were very powerful in the United States. Now, but the United States, as with Britain, as with everywhere else, reached at a point where it's no longer profitable to do that, where the capitalist class starts to divert its energies not into finding new and more efficient ways of producing commodities, but just efficient ways of generating capital. And the most efficient way of generating capital is not to make commodities at all, but to just move money around. That happens very quickly under capitalism. In the original capitalist nations, it very quickly becomes the case that the tendency towards parasitism becomes very pronounced. And at that point, you then get, for that and various other reasons, the merger of money capital and industrial capital to make finance capital. And then you get a system which is essentially dominated by the banks. We call it imperialism. These are the reasons why American industry atrophied and declined. And it's built into the very nature of American capitalism itself. So is the Trump administration going to be able to reverse any of this? No, not through tax cuts and deregulation. You do tax cuts, the American capitalist class will just pocket the cash and say, thank you very much. Maybe they'll stick some more in an asset bubble. You deregulate, unless you, again, are prepared to reduce the status of the American worker down to what used to be called third world or developing world status, you're not going to get the success in reindustrialization that the Trump administration wants. Now, there's been certain experiments in the United States, around in the American South, regarding almost special economic zones in certain states, the attempt to almost ban trade union organizations in certain states, right to work states. This is all designed to try and push the American working class back into a position where it can be hyper exploited to the point where it will be profitable for American capitalists to invest in industry again. None of this has resulted in a massive industrial regeneration. It just hasn't. And the Trump administration's, Reaganite policy is not going to lead to anything other than more parasitism, essentially. Now, to go back to the question of does this strategy actually mean any real difference in with regards to the United States' position in the world? So the United States' position in the world is considered in this paper, and some in the multipolar media sphere got very excited initially and said, "Oh, there's a split between the United States and Europe. The United States now considers the EU an enemy," which it doesn't. That's nonsense. This is essentially like what's going on at the moment is that the US and the Europeans are wrangling in public over the best way forward. This is what's going on. The US ruling class has a split within it that is related to a clash of priorities. Some in the US establishment, because to make the difference clear in terms, you have the US ruling class, the biggest capitalists in the United States, the biggest landowners in the United States, those who own the stock in the biggest companies, or the largest amount of stock in the biggest companies. You have them, and then you have the US establishment, which is really the sort of intellectual leadership, the think tank world, the NGO world, the political leadership, the academic leaders. Those are I would say those that do the thinking, or are employed to do the thinking for the ruling class to come up with the strategies. And you have a clash there between those who want to go after the Russians and win the war in Ukraine, whilst not risking too much themselves, of course, and those who want to go after the Chinese, and of course those who want to do both. There are still those who see Iran as the priority. Now, this row, it remains unresolved, because in the U.S. national security strategy, they talk about needing to reach an accommodation with the Russians. But again, you need to look at beyond the wording there, beyond the rhetoric of the Trump administration. So what is it that they actually want to do? They want to reach an accommodation with the Russians, and this is the cause of the wrangling between the US and the Europeans, which is, well, what will that look like? Because the US still doesn't want to give up the project in Ukraine. That much is absolutely obvious. And again, forget what Trump says. Let's assume, for the purposes of argument, that Trump is absolutely sincere when he says, "We want to get out, Ukraine war, very bad war." Let's assume he's completely sincere. Doesn't matter. Unless he's prepared to wage like an open political war against the US permanent state, particularly like the State Department, the intelligence agencies, some in the military leadership, who are absolutely dedicated to furthering this proxy war against the Russian Federation. Unless you're prepared to take them on, and of course the great majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate, who are all on board with the proxy war against Russia and continuing it, then nothing he says is going to make a blind bit of difference. So this accommodation that they want to reach with the Russians is impossible for them to do so, because what they would like to do, and this is the real tactics on the ground, is pause the war, essentially draw a line on the map and declare that to be the line of control. Again, we've said this before, redevelop Ukraine to the point where it can start the war again in 5 years' time, then restart it with the Europeans doing most of the heavy lifting. This is what they want to do. Now, the Europeans are bitching and moaning because they realize that without American power, there's no credible threat lying behind the Europeans at all. This is the fundamental problem for the Europeans. Without the US, there is no NATO. Because why should the Russians take the German, French, and British armies or armed forces in general particularly seriously? Everybody knows the Bundeswehr is a joke. Everybody, the British themselves are admitting that their own naval power basically is falling apart. The British can't produce an armored fighting vehicle that works. Their tank fleet consists of 30 tanks. And the British generals admit that they'd run out of ammunition after 2 weeks if they went up against the Russians. None of that is likely to change, by the way. No matter what Mark Rutte says, no matter what Keir Starmer says, no matter what fevered delusions Emmanuel Macron suffers from, no matter how many complaints Friedrich Merz handwrites to various moderators on various websites complaining about things Germans have said about him online, none of this is going to come off. They can't do it. Again, the Russians know that. And the Europeans know that America might be atrophied. The US might have an atrophied manufacturing base, and its military is nothing like as powerful as its boosters like to say. But again, like, the US can still pose a credible threat. The Europeans can't. And the wrangling at the moment is over, like, well, who should run the war against the Russians? That's what the wrangle's actually about. It's not, and also this talk of like wanting to promote European sovereignty and stuff like that, and have more Viktor Orbáns and fewer Emmanuel Macrons. Well, I'm sure there are some in the Trump administration that believe that. Again, unlikely to happen. You'll end up with more nationalistic, bourgeois nationalistic European leaders. You are seeing it already, but again, these will always be completely in line with the overall overarching strategy of US power, because without US power, there is no European power. European power has existed as an adjunct to US power since 1945, and that has not and will not change. Also, again, never mistake the fact that the Europeans are in an inferior role with regard to the US, of the Europeans having no bargaining power. They do. As I've covered before, where the Europeans have over $1 trillion go each way with regard to trade between the European bloc and the United States, that's $1 trillion reasons why the US isn't leaving Europe. They want the Europeans to spend more. They want the Europeans to take on more of an active role in providing troops for NATO, but that's designed not to have the US leave NATO. Thomas Massie isn't the one setting the policy here, though it's a positive thing that he's put that bill forward. No, this is in order that NATO can become more credible, not less, because there are those in the Pentagon and the State Department and other American institutions who know very well that if there's no US, there is no NATO. So they're trying to actually increase the credibility of NATO, not decrease its credibility. The rapprochement that they proclaim they want with the Russians is not really about having good state-to-state relations again. It's keeping things on a managed level and re-engaging in the war later on. That's what it's about. So the nonsense about like this is the US falling out with the Europeans, this is all just fevered rhetoric. When it comes down to it, in a few months' time, there'll be another NATO summit, and Trump will get his commitment for increased military spending, and all of this will be forgotten, basically. Now, the other thing that the strategy talks about in quite some depth is, of course, the US wants to retain the balance of power, but the US must retain, as has already been said when we're talking about this, the US must retain the most powerful military, the premier position when it comes to both the manufacturing in high-tech sectors, or must gain back the premier position in high-tech manufacturing, must maintain the dominant role in the energy trade, must maintain a dominant role in the global economic system, and must retain a military which is capable of enforcing that. So this isn't a backing away into like a John Mearsheimer inspired realism. This is just another way of the US administration essentially talking, presenting itself, presenting the needs of the system. So there's not going to be like a backing away. There's not going to be like a move to a US which is just going to restrict itself to the Western Hemisphere or something like that. Though it's very clear in the paper that they regard the Western Hemisphere as their personal property. So this is essentially a restatement of the need for the US to maintain its dominance in these various different fields. And how could it ever be otherwise? The belief that the US was going to end its empire in some sort of negotiated stand down, that's something which is an absolutely bizarre utopian belief. They couldn't, and they could not do that. If you tried to do that, it would cause like you would actually get significant splits within the US hierarchy. If any US administration tried to back away from this system, because let's go back to the point. The US has built since the late 80s, early 90s, a globe-spanning system of economy and trade, from which the US gains the most from in terms of the advantages when trade is conducted anywhere in the world in dollars. Of course, it can't. The US accrues benefit from that, but the US sets the terms of global trade for everyone and essentially acts as essentially a giant debt collector, or the institutions of the global order work as a giant debt collector for the United States. And trade everywhere and in every area is oriented around rules that the US, the British, and Europeans have written. Now, the reasons why they're getting so mad is because that system is slowly being eroded. But the US doesn't want to back away from that system. It can't. It wants to reinforce that system. And that is made absolutely clear in the paper. Like, so for all the talk of sovereignty and respect, and we don't want transnational bodies getting in the way. Yeah, they don't want transnational bodies getting in the way of the United States. They want the transnational bodies to remain in place to enforce the US will on various different subjugated nations. So this is, again, you need to actually read the damn thing and put it in the context of the US as a premier imperial power. Not only are they not going to back away from that, but they can't. So the other point here is like the idea that the idea of the US moving to retreating slightly from its previously stated positions, accepting limitations on its power. Now, there is an element here where that's there's an element of truth there, but also it's only an element. So there's the fact that when it comes to like Europe, and when it comes to even the Western Hemisphere, they talk about enlisting regional partners or allies to enforce the US will for them. And this is a slight retreat, because they openly say, again, this is something that periodically Biden and Obama would say, was that the US can't be everywhere all the time. So they need to basically bring in reliable allies to do a lot of the dirty work for them. And this is why they're talking about strengthening the Quad in the Asia Pacific region. They hoped anyway, to enlist the Indian ruling class in essentially counterbalancing China. Now, it would seem that the Indian ruling class itself is very split over which way they're going to jump regarding the relations with the Chinese and relations with the nations of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and their role in BRICS, etc. But the US is clear that they want to strengthen the Quad, so that's US, India, Japan, and Australia, and specifically build up India, Japan, and Australia as being a counterbalance to the Chinese, and also to reverse Chinese gains in the Asia Pacific region. Again, they're quite clear about this, and also maintain dominance of like in the naval sphere, both on the surface level ships, and of course submarine warfare, in order that they they hope to control how China trades with the world. Because one of the things they keep saying is that, oh, we want to preserve freedom of navigation in the first island chain, South China Sea and around Taiwan. Well, again, you have to unpack the language. What that means is they want to dominate those key sea lanes, because one of the things that the US knows that it has to achieve if it's ever to wage a successful war of aggression against the Chinese. They know they can't possibly hope to do a successful land invasion. That would be ludicrous. But they hope that if they can use US naval power to choke off Chinese trade with the rest of the world, and that will enable them to actually win, because that will produce an internal crisis in China. Or at least that's what the US establishment hopes to do. Now, I don't think that will work. The Chinese know very well that that's what they want to do and have been working on ways to counter it. But this is what they want to use the Quad for. It's clearly their tactic for going after China is to build up puppet regimes like the Philippines, to also build up Japan, to build up the military of Taiwan as well. This is what the Biden administration was talking about. Trump's kind of backed away from that a little bit, at least in the last few months. He might change his mind again soon. But it's absolutely clear when it comes to like the Asia Pacific region that the US still plans to try and seal off shipping lanes from Chinese trade. And again, like you're seeing more and more acts of US piracy on the high seas with regard to Iran, with regard to Venezuela and Cuba. So this is something which the US is clearly going to do more and more of, to intimidate shipping. And then the escalation point from there is they start hitting Chinese and Russian shipping, which they've already been hitting Russian shipping, that eventually the Chinese and the Russians are going to have to do armed escorts for their shipping to put the US off from doing piracy, which is what the US has been doing. So this is a clear strategy now that the US is applying, more naval-based aggression. So they also want to maintain their leadership role in West Asia. They're very clear about that. They're very clear about basically building more puppet regimes, which will then normalize with Israel. Again, they want more nations to join the Abraham Accords. They haven't changed their desire for regime change in Iran. They've realized that the frontal assault option didn't work. So now they're trying other methods. Now, there was a series of interesting statements made by Ayatollah Khamenei about this recently, when it's on his official Twitter account, the one that's in English, where he's talking about, quite correctly, the external moves to undermine Iran from within. So building intelligence networks of Iranian compradors and traitors who will then act to undermine Iran more slowly. And that will be a more effective way of undermining Iran than the kind of frontal assault that the Israelis and the US tried earlier this year. And this is a danger that the Iranians know about and have identified. And of course, this is true. And this is something that the US has known for a long time. It's the Obama administration was trying to cultivate open traitors inside Iran. It's clear that the US and Israel and the British had developed quite an extensive network of internal saboteurs before the launch of the war, and then they basically sacrificed those networks in order to try and decapitate the Iranian government. It didn't work, but the US still wants to pursue that. They will not stop until the pro-sovereignty, pro-independence elements in the Islamic Republic are pushed to one side or overthrown entirely. Because again, they wish to bring Iran back to being a tame servant of the US-led order. And this is why they keep the Pahlavi family on the payroll. It's not just because they like the great and glorious legacy of the Iranian monarchy. It's that they ultimately do plan to restore them someday. Again, the US doesn't spend money on useless puppets. That's why Batista's daughter got cut off a few years ago. So this agenda hasn't changed. They're talking more about having their power being reliant on puppet regimes in West Asia. So that does reflect a retreat from the high point of the Bush administration 20 years ago, where you got a lot of the neocon intellectual types talking about the fact that they were going to march all the way to Tehran. This has now become obvious that they can't do that. So they're trying other more insidious methods of asserting their power. But nonetheless, they are clear that they want to destroy the Iranian government as it is currently constituted and push Iran back into being a comprador regime. They're also clear, but from the statements in this paper and from other statements made by the Trump administration, that they wish to essentially use the African nations as a site of raw resource extraction. And this, by the way, is why the Trump administration has been making threats against the Nigerians. Now, of course, Bola Tinubu, the completely rotten comprador that runs Nigeria, isn't exactly posing any kind of threat to the United States. But what they want to do is, of course, is to intimidate the Nigerians and others into giving U.S. corporations very favorable rights to access key minerals in Nigeria, in the DRC, in other places as well. So they, again, like the Trump administration, what the Trump administration wants with the African nations is a further advance on the neo-colonial relationship that exists there already. So, is any of this likely to be enacted? Are they going to get a sovereign, self-sufficient United States? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. All the reindustrialization elements talked about here, all the points about developing American resources, this will go nowhere. Under the current system, all this will do is absorb a lot of public subsidy, boost some stock prices, and then nothing else will happen. So the reindustrialization aspect will be marginal at best or non-existent at least. And the idea that the US is going to be able to preserve its power by developing networks of essentially client states that will do its bidding around the world, well, they might have some success in certain areas, but in truth, the world is moving more and more against them. Now, this doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of twists and turns in this, that the US won't have a certain degree of success for a small amount of time in fostering more comprador regimes. For instance, they've got their way in Syria. And the interesting thing is that there's a slow evolution in the thinking of the Chinese and the Russians, which we'll come to in just a moment, where, as to how they see the expression of this US soft power. So the US national security strategy, it is much more, it represents a good deal of continuity with previous expressions as carried as of this done by the Obama administration and the Biden administration, which said a lot of the same things. They said that they didn't want the US to be everywhere all the time. This was, of course, a reaction to the US's disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which the US, of course, lost in both cases, and the need to develop partners, etc., but retain US dominance and control via essentially the neo-colonial system of the last 30 years. This is another attempt to keep that going. The rhetoric has changed. The objectives that they say they want to pursue is slightly changed, but the overall thrust of it remains the same, because how could it be different? How could you have a US president who was calling for the dismantling of US imperial power? It would be impossible for that to be the case. The main differences are the Trump administration is pushing the Europeans to essentially take more responsibility for managing the war with Russia, whilst the US focuses elsewhere. That's the major difference. And that's not like a strategic difference. That's a tactical difference. Whereas the US under the Biden administration was very much playing the lead role, the Trump administration would rather stand back a little bit and have others do it. I don't think that will be a success either, because the Europeans aren't capable of carrying any threat. nor would they be capable of keeping the Ukrainian Banderite regime propped up for another few years without the US standing behind them. But overall, this is a change in rhetoric, a change in the expressed priorities, but the real priorities remain the same. And that is obvious when the paper calls over and over again for the US to retain the most powerful military in the world, for the US to retain dominance over trade routes, over the energy business, over key areas of high-tech production, or to regain dominance there. And the lasting change that this represents is one that matters the most, which is that there is an admission, more of an admission this time, that they want other countries to do the donkey work of preserving the American-led order. But again, that was there even in the Biden and the Obama era papers. So what it represents is the fact that the US has been pushed back, but that it has every intention of using all the tools at its disposal, and these tools include, of course, other countries, to try and regain its positions. Now, this won't work for a variety of reasons, because the Trump administration will only represent another phase of imperial decline inside the United States, but it'll create a lot of chaos and destruction as it continues to fail. Now, let's just pause here and check in on everybody. So good to see so many of you tuning in today. Just got to check on this. Yeah, so if you have not done so already, be sure to like and share the stream, and we'll move on to talking about the Russian and the Chinese strategies. Now, again, as I said, Russian strategy is a little bit different in terms of what the Russians call for. Now, there's two key things, two key papers that the Russian security strategy is based on. One's from 2021, one's from just earlier this year. The one from 2021 represented a real evolution, because prior to 2021, Russian security papers going back to 2015 were still referring to the West as partners, as needing to act together to tackle terrorism and that kind of thing. Again, this was rhetorical in some ways, but also represented the status of Russian thinking at that time, given that there was the pro-Western element in the Russian state was much stronger prior to 2015. So 2015 is the turning point, because you have had then the Maidan coup, the uprisings in Crimea and Donbass, the defection of the Ukrainian army almost en masse in Crimea over to the Russian side, and the absorption of Crimea into the Russian Federation. That all takes place, and it causes then a recalculation over the next 6 years, until you get to the national security or security policy of 2021 by the Russian Federation, which represented a shift, because there the open calling for a divorce or a detachment from the West, which is that it framed the US and the Western Bloc as perpetually engaging in what the paper describes as unfriendly actions, and that that this is leading to the need for Russia to become more economically independent from the West. So the 2021 paper talked about the need to reduce Russian usage of the dollar in international trade, to develop the means to be economically independent, which they've been working on for probably since at least 2008 to 2012 period. Since the Georgian War, they'd had to start reassessing how they were going to be conducting themselves economically, not just be a resource appendage of the West. And by 2021, it was being openly stated that this needed to happen. And the need for the to be more distanced from the United States in particular. So the Russian security strategy from 2021 has been quite successful in terms of they've reduced their exposure to the dollar. They've reduced their exposure industrially to supply chains dominated by the United States and the West. And they have reoriented themselves towards, first of all, a certain amount of domestic production of things needed for Russian industry. So whereas prior to 2010, at least, in fact, prior to 2015, a lot of like the crucial component parts, like the Russian oil industry, came from Western countries. That's changed in the last 10 years. A lot of that is now produced internally inside Russia itself. Funnily enough, having to rebuild things that were destroyed in the 90s. So, for instance, Russian machine tools industry was destroyed in the 1990s via essentially oligarchs taking it, asset stripping it, and destroying it. Then suddenly the Putin administration realized that, well, we need to be able to produce our own spare parts for the oil and gas industries, and therefore we need to redevelop the ability to actually do that. And so there's several industrial sectors which have been redeveloped over the last decade in Russia, which had almost withered away in the 90s. So essentially the Putin system has had to undo what the Yeltsin administration was doing in the 90s, which was to turn Russia into a raw resource appendage of the West. And that's the only role that, of course, the US, British, and Germans and French were ever prepared to accept Russia into the club under. Now, the other points here, so you get the 2021 strategy, which now identifies the United States essentially as an enemy without saying it, and the need to economically develop the country to the point where it can escape Western control. And they've done that to a certain degree. It's not completely successful. There's many critiques that could be had of that, and you can read those from the KPRF. However, the more recent strategy revolves around the need to actually have a information space security. So what the 2025 strategy talks about is the need to actually have a effective counter propaganda system for internal security inside the Russian Federation. So what they're aiming to, they talk about essentially preserving the unity of the multi-ethnic, what they call the multi-ethnic Russian nation. So one of the points that the Putin administrations have talked about for quite some time now, in fact, arguably from Putin's earliest time in office, is that they're trying to unify the multi-ethnic Russian nation and give it some kind of new identity. There isn't, initially, they didn't want it to be Soviet. Again, the Putin administration remained very, very anti-communist for a long time. Still is to a certain extent. United Russia still is, but they've had to drop a lot of that. So after 2008, you started to see the national unity project of the Putin system evolve. Prior to that, it had been much more anti-communist. For instance, in 2008, I believe, Medvedev and Putin were going to like the memorials for the Katyn massacre, which was, of course, a massacre carried out by the Nazis that was later pinned on the Soviet Union. And then the Gorbachev and the Yeltsin era traitors essentially then agreed with the reactionary Poles that, yes, they had massacred all these Polish officers in 1940 to 41. Now, so you got like Putin and Medvedev going to these anti-communist memorials, which again, like commemorating massacres done by the Nazis pinned on the communists. And this then started to wither away, certainly after the Georgian War, and especially after the beginning of the Ukraine War in 2014. So now the Russian government is talking more about preserving national memory, stopping anti-Russian distortions of history. This almost entirely refers to World War II. And what he's very interesting to read in this document is just how much it resembles policies pursued in the Brezhnev era, because in the Brezhnev era, the CPSU was trying to promote more of a Soviet sense of identity, the idea of the Soviet Union as this multi-ethnic brotherhood of nations, which it was to a large extent. There were problems in that, but it was very successful quite a long time in doing so. Now now you have like the heirs, or many of them, including Putin, were sort of Brezhnevite cadre back in the day, essentially doing the same thing with regard to Russia, because they have identified correctly that one of the key area, the key pressure point that the US and the British and others and other imperialists are trying to push on with regard to the internal security of Russia, the key contradiction they're trying to turn into an antagonism, is the fact that there's so many different ethnic groups and religious groups inside Russia, and trying to exploit that, as they did with regard to the South Caucasus, where and in Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, etc., where they promoted and fostered the insurgencies there for a very long time. So this paper from earlier this year talks about building up a Russian identity, promotion of the Russian language, but at the same time preserving the minority cultures, minority languages and traditions, and that they want to act to prevent any manifestation of tensions between different ethnic and religious groups within the Russian Federation. That's what they want to do. And they want to promote the idea of a sort of harmonious Russian identity, and prevent the differences in Russia being exploited by external powers. And when I say that, it's mainly the US and the British that they're thinking of, because they're the ones who were ultimately behind a lot of the stuff that went on in Chechnya. So what this document is focused on is essentially the building a system which will prevent the ability of the imperialists to exploit internal contradictions. Now, curiously enough, what's not mentioned in this paper is, of course, class differences in Russia. What's mentioned is ethnic differences, cultural differences, linguistic differences, and the need to overcome those with a unified Russian identity, whilst at the same time respecting different languages, traditions, and cultures and religions, etc. In many ways, it resembles almost, we're just replacing the word socialism for the word Russia, the nationality policy of the old USSR, which is amusing to read it. And so much of what they talk about in terms of promoting a shared identity all relates to the Great Patriotic War and defending the achievements of the Soviet Union against slander from the West. And that's what they're talking about. And also the idea of this Russian identity, which is shared by everybody and means a sort of equality and brotherhood within the nation. Well, that all comes ultimately from work done by Stalin. That kind of nationality policy. It's not the policy of the Tsardom. It's not the policy of Nicholas the Bloody or Alexander III or earlier Tsars. It's a product of the Soviet period. So what the strange sort of model that the Putin system has now is where it wears a lot of the symbolism and where's the aesthetics of the period of the Tsardom in a lot of its official functions, etc. But the identity that they're talking about, really for the great mass of Russians, is essentially the Soviet identity. That's essentially what they're building a lot of this on. They can't sell like the average Russian worker or peasant on the idea of reviving the great glories of the Tsardom. That kind of stuff speaks to like weirdo intellectual types and clowns like Dugin and like oligarchs who profess to be super patriotic, but in actual fact would love nothing more than to go back to the glory days of the 90s. mainly that kind of stuff exists as like propaganda points to engage in sort of anti-communism. This is the weirdness of the state strategy of the Putin system. On the one hand, it draws very heavily from the Soviet period. On the other hand, it commissions, like in the cultural sphere, all kinds of like anti-communist shit that it engages in to try and keep the balance there between the historical memory of the Soviet period and the reality that the Russian capitalist class is ferociously anti-communist and is anti-communist before and over and above anything else. So there are contradictions in there, of course, but the West could exploit. But what you see from the Russian paper is that whereas it does talk about promotion of the Russian language and culture overseas, this is, of course, something that the Putin administration has been very keen on. The great bulk of both the 2021 and the 2025 papers, they're not based on dominating this area of the world or that area of the world or getting proxies to do things for them. No, it's based on becoming a more sovereign and a country, the 2021 paper, that is, becoming a more sovereign country, freeing itself of dollar domination by the dollar and Western trade. And the 2025 paper is all about internal development and in development of a shared Russian identity. It's not about dominating other areas of the world. I mean, it talks about integrating the areas of the former Ukraine into the Russian Federation, but this isn't an act of imperialist domination, as we've covered many times before. So when you look at like the Russian security documents, these are all about internal security. These are all about warding off external threats. The American paper is all about preserving the US's place as the global hegemon. You read them, it couldn't be more clear. So if we go then to, we're looking at the Russians, we go to look again at the Chinese. A similar thing occurs when we're looking at the Chinese concepts of national security. And if you examine the Chinese document from the Ministry of Defense, this was a white paper that was put into place, that was brought out earlier this year. But it reflects what Xi Jinping has called in a speech given in December of 2020, a holistic approach to national security, meaning that the Chinese consider national security in terms of not just like defense or even industrial strength, but also like they identified a while back the fact that the security also means the connection between the party, the government, and the Chinese masses, and the need to keep that essentially strong. And so the Chinese talk about an awful lot in their strategic document. That's again from the Chinese Ministry of Defense. The need to pursue independence when it comes to economy. So they identified risk areas for the Chinese economy of exposure to over-reliance on Western technology. That's the reference, of course, to the chip wars waged by the Biden administration. And what the Chinese government has done really over the last decade is work consistently towards being able to be freed from dependence on Western tech, be it microprocessors or anything else. But also, so that the development of Chinese technology to be self-sustaining on a domestic basis, meaning that you do not reliant upon the US, the Europeans, or any hostile power for the continuing development of technology. So whereas previously the Chinese had to buy an awful lot of chips in from the Europeans and the Americans, they've now got themselves to the point where they make the great bulk of these domestically. And that was one of the key challenges that Xi outlined as being something that the Chinese needed to respond to. So they also stress that they need to be able to guarantee the security of the people, meaning that the income of the people, the standards of living of the people, the security of food, all of this is part of the holistic Chinese concepts of national security. And Xi Jinping writes and speaks and a lot about that in like the 4 volumes I've got of like this book with these books. It's called The Governance of China. Rather weighty term, but very useful for finding out and looking at what the priorities of the Chinese government are. And food security is a crucial priority for them, because they know very well, if we refer back to the US's plans to choke off trade to China, that previously, like due to insufficient development of the land in China, there'd been not enough grain and other dietary requirements grown and produced inside China itself. So one of the priorities, that national security priorities that the Chinese identified, was the need to grow more of their own food and to cut down on imports. And this is something that they have successfully done. So when the Trump administration tried to engage in a trade war with them by threatening to, we're not going to sell you our soybeans anymore, the Chinese found alternative sources and looked to, of course, develop their own agricultural production. And Xi talked about that in the speech on food production in 2020. He emphasized the point that the Chinese government now saw it as an absolute priority to develop many more areas of potential agricultural land and make the maximum usage out of agricultural land. And what's an interesting part of Xi's speech from 2020 on food production is the fact that he emphasizes that there's been far too many developments of turning agricultural land into essentially ornamental areas, that he's criticizing a tendency amongst some Chinese cities and regions to not turn like agricultural land into sites of food production, but to essentially put nice looking ornamental lakes on there. And one of the things that's been done over the past decade is that the Chinese have been opening up an awful lot more land for agricultural production and engaging in projects such as reclaiming desert areas and turning them into farmland, which again, they've been successful at. So what you see in the Xi era is the identification of a lot of threats that had grown up in the Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao period to Chinese security. And so that's why you see in a lot of the documents from the Xi era and a lot of the actions in the Xi era, a real emphasis on pushing further the role of the party in economic and state life, which had suffered under the previous 2 presidents, Hu and Yang. And so in the recent document from earlier this year, the Chinese white paper, you see the role of the party being promoted further. So the role of the party in politically leading, so that the party should have strong elements in like all key areas of industry. So even in private companies, like there's a strong Communist Party presence. That the standards of the party are raised further in order that wretched elements get chased out of it. That the key part of security for the state is making sure that the Chinese constitution is defended, that the role of the party is paramount, that everything is unified under the leadership of the CPC. Now that, of course, reflects the learning done by the Chinese about the Soviet experience, which is that the Soviet traitors destroyed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union because it was a barrier basically to fully restoring capitalism. The Chinese have very much taken that to heart and are constantly talking about and enacting the raising of standards inside the party, the chasing out of corruption, the promotion of the role of the party in every single aspect of life, which is something I'm going to do more on in the future, because it's very interesting how the Chinese are dealing with the manifest contradictions which are created by the significant private sector and the presence of a capitalist class within China. But they're very clear that for them, national security does mean the satisfaction of the needs of the great mass of the people. that there is a national security element to things like the poverty reduction campaign, that the role of the party has to remain paramount in all areas of economy and state, meaning that, again, as I said previously, that even in areas with significant private sector presence, the role of the party there is being reinforced. So like party branches being built in private industry, etc. So the Chinese concept of national security is holistic. They know very well that if the needs of the people aren't satisfied, and if the party and the state is divorced from the people, that will be the opportunity the imperialists need to finally destroy the People's Republic. So they are aware of all of these things. Whether it will cause a significant change in the fact of the presence of quite wealthy and powerful capitalists in China, that's another question entirely. But it is, of course, connected to this. And the Chinese concept of security, and again, this is called, one of their approaches is called the Global Security Initiative, is the idea of China promoting a framework advocating common cooperation and joint security. And their usual talk about respect for the UN Charter, etc. And this contrasts directly with the approach used by the United States, which now under the Trump administration talks about the need for respect, sovereignty, etc., but then puts a gun to the head of anybody who doesn't please them and says, "Fuck you, pay me." So again, like the Chinese approach is again holistic. It is based upon the idea of actually respecting the sovereignty of other nations, which is why the Chinese do much better in their dealings with African nations than the US does at the moment. So the Chinese approach is, again, a non-imperialist approach. Like you read the Chinese security documentation, it's clear that this is all about their approach to the internal security of the country, which is why they're taught that the Xi leadership talks so much about food security, technological security, basically making it so that the US cannot intervene to destroy development in China by cutting off a supply of one thing or another. And they're very aware of the fact that the US plans to try and choke off Chinese trade routes, which is why they've been strengthening their military deterrence in terms of the Chinese Navy and the Chinese ability to essentially sink America's blue water Navy. So China and Russia both represent comparison points to the United States. They represent comparison points to the United States as in concepts of security of two non-imperialist powers, which are concerned overwhelmingly with internal security, internal unification of the nation, securing of the nation against economic and military threats. Whereas the US one, despite its mentioning, it's having a prominent mention of reindustrialization, is all about maintaining global hegemony. It's all about maintaining the US's dominant position in the world. It's all about destroying rivals, which is fundamentally what the language about the competition with China is all about. It's about pushing back Chinese progress, destroying the progress that China has made in things like the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is what we would refer to as the continuity of the US strategy. It's the continuity with the Biden administration, continuity with the Obama administration. Remember, the Obama administration was trying to cut off capital flows to China via the creation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and push the capital flows into other nations. This is another expression of the same strategy, but with different tactics applied to it. And it's the real difference between the security as considered by non-imperialist countries and security as considered by the United States and the US ruling class. So I will pause now for further questions, etc. Welcome to everybody who's just joined us. So we have just over 300 online at the moment. I'll just check in with the various different platforms. Thank you to everybody who's joined us thus far. This broadcast will become available on both Patreon on Substack afterwards in an edited form. Just a couple of other things. So coming up on Tuesday of next week, we're going to be having the next installment of the Gramsci series. That'll be on a live stream on Patreon, and also on Patreon on Monday will be the latest Q&A. So if you have a question, submit it on Patreon now. We'll get to it that way. We will things there for now, I think. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. I hope that that's given you some illumination as to the continuities of the US national security strategy and the way in which it can be compared unfavorably to the strategies of the Russians and the Chinese, and leave you pretty clear as to who the imperialist power is here and will continue to be. I will be back with you again tomorrow with a specific program dedicated to the latest from the Ukraine war, so please be sure to join me for that one. Check out the episodes of Decline and Fall that's been out in the last week. So our interview with Gabriel Rockhill, that's an exceptional discussion. I hope you've all checked that out if it if you haven't done so already. And of course, the second episode of Media Twats, which was out just the other day. So be sure to check those out. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee and Substack. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, and it will be again a Ukraine special. So thank you to everybody who's joined in, and be seeing you again very soon.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.